October 1907. The stock market is collapsing. Banks are failing. Depositors are rioting in the streets trying to withdraw their money before it disappears. The United States has no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no government agency with the power to stop the bleeding. And in the middle of the chaos, one man summons the most powerful bankers in America to his private library in Manhattan. He locks the doors, and he refuses to let anyone leave until they agree to save the economy. That man was J.P. Morgan. And what happened next wasn't just a rescue, it was a consolidation of power so complete that Congress would later call it the money trust. This is the story of how one banker became more powerful than the government itself. The man, John Pierpont Morgan, was born in 1837 into a banking family. His father was an international banker. Morgan didn't build his empire from nothing. He inherited the infrastructure and connections. But what he did with that inheritance changed American capitalism forever. By the early 1900s, Morgan controlled more wealth than most nations. He financed railroads. He reorganized steel companies. He bailed out the U.S. government during the Panic of 1893. When Morgan walked into a room, markets moved. When he spoke, legislators listened. He wasn't elected, he wasn't appointed. But by 1907, he effectively controlled the American economy. The Panic of 1907. The Panic of 1907 didn't start with Morgan. It started with a failed scheme to corner the copper market. F. Augustus Heinze, an overzealous Wall Street banker, attempted to manipulate copper prices. The plan collapsed. Banks that had lent money to Heinze's scheme suddenly faced massive losses. Depositors panicked. If those banks failed, their money disappeared. What started as a run on a few banks quickly spread. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, New York City's third largest trust, collapsed on October 22nd. That single failure sent shockwaves through the entire banking system. Within days, banks across the country were facing runs. Stock prices plummeted. The market lost nearly half its value. Loans dried up. Factories cut production by 16%. The economy itself shrank, with real GDP falling 11%. And there was no one to stop it. The United States had no central bank, no institution with the authority or resources to inject liquidity into the system. The federal government tried. The Treasury pumped millions into weak banks. But it wasn't enough. By early November, the entire American financial system was on the brink of total collapse. That's when Morgan acted. The library, November 3rd, 1907. A Sunday evening, Morgan summoned the presidents of New York's trust companies to his private library on Madison Avenue. The building itself was a monument to his wealth. Marble floors, rare manuscripts, priceless art. But that night, it became the de facto headquarters of the American economy. Morgan didn't ask the bankers to come. He commanded them, and when they arrived, he locked the doors. For the next 3 weeks, Morgan and his associates worked from that library. They examined the books of every major institution. They decided which banks were solvent and which were beyond saving. They channeled money from strong institutions to weaker ones. Morgan personally pledged millions of his own money. He convinced other wealthy industrialists to do the same. John D. Rockefeller contributed $10 million. Other financiers followed. But this wasn't charity, this was control. Morgan decided who got rescued and who failed. He decided which industries received loans and which didn't. He decided the terms of every bailout. By mid-November, the panic subsided. The runs on banks slowed. The stock market stabilized. The economy began to recover. America credited Morgan with saving the nation. He was hailed as a hero, the man who stepped up when the government couldn't. But others saw something darker. One man, unelected and unaccountable, had just demonstrated that he held more power over the American economy than the president or Congress. The consolidation. The Panic of 1907 didn't just save the economy, it allowed Morgan to consolidate power on unprecedented scale. During the crisis, Morgan used chaos to orchestrate corporate takeovers. He forced smaller banks to merge with his institutions. He acquired failing companies at pennies on the dollar. The most egregious example was his takeover of Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. Morgan convinced President Theodore Roosevelt the acquisition was necessary to prevent further collapse. Roosevelt, desperate to stabilize the economy, agreed not to challenge it under antitrust laws. Morgan absorbed Tennessee Coal into U.S. Steel, the massive corporation he had created. In one move, he eliminated a major competitor and expanded his monopoly. This pattern repeated across industries. By the time the panic ended, Morgan controlled vast sectors. Steel, railroads, banking, shipping. It was consolidation disguised as salvation. The money trust. The scale of Morgan's power didn't go unnoticed. In 1912, Louisiana Congressman Arsene Pujo launched an investigation. The goal? Determine whether a small group of financiers had monopolized American banking and industry. The Pujo Committee hearings were explosive. Testimony after testimony revealed the extent of Morgan's control. The committee found that Morgan and a handful of allied bankers held 341 directorships in 112 corporations with total resources of $22 billion. In 1912, that was more than the entire annual federal budget. They controlled the major banks, they controlled the railroads, they controlled manufacturing, they controlled the flow of credit throughout the economy. The committee concluded that a money trust existed. A small cartel of financiers, led by J.P. Morgan, had gained consolidated control of numerous industries and monopolized them through abuse of the public trust. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., father of the famous aviator, went further. He testified that the Panic of 1907 may have been deliberately manufactured by Wall Street elites to gain ultimate control over banking and industry. Whether the panic was manufactured or merely exploited, the result was the same. Morgan and his associates emerged from the crisis with unprecedented power. The backlash. The Pujo hearings turned public opinion. Morgan was no longer a savior. He was a threat. The scrutiny took a physical toll. Morgan became ill in February 1913. He died March 31, 1913, at age 75. 9 months later, the Federal Reserve Act passed. The United States finally created a central bank, but the Federal Reserve wasn't created to replace Morgan's power. It was created because of it. The 1907 panic exposed a fundamental flaw. The economy depended on the judgment of a few private individuals. What if they weren't there? What if they acted in their own interests? The Federal Reserve was supposed to answer those questions, a public institution serving as lender of last resort. But here's the irony. The men who designed the Federal Reserve were Morgan's associates. November 1910. Senator Nelson Aldrich convened a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. Attendees included Paul Warburg, Frank Vanderlip, Henry Davison from J.P. Morgan Company, and Benjamin Strong. These men drafted the legislation that became the Federal Reserve Act. They designed a system that would regulate banking, but they designed it in a way that preserved much of the power they already held. It was a reform, but a reform written by the people it was supposed to regulate. The legacy. Morgan died before the Federal Reserve officially replaced him, but his influence didn't. The banking system he shaped persists. The corporate structures he built endure. The consolidation of power he achieved set the template for American finance for the next century. Morgan proved that in a crisis, private power can eclipse public authority. That one man with enough wealth and enough connections can control an entire economy. The Panic of 1907 is often taught as a story of heroic intervention, a private banker stepping up when the government failed, but it's also a story of opportunistic consolidation. A crisis exploited to eliminate competitors, absorb industries, and concentrate power. The question isn't whether Morgan saved the economy. He did. The question is what he gained in the process. The pattern. The 1907 panic established a pattern that repeats throughout American history. Financial crisis, government paralysis, private intervention, consolidation of power. 2008 looked remarkably similar. Banks failed. The government stepped in. But the banks that survived emerged larger and more powerful. The same names, the same dynamics, the same outcome. Morgan understood something fundamental. Chaos creates opportunity. And if you have enough resources to survive the chaos, you can reshape the system. He didn't just save the economy in 1907, he redesigned it. No government agency with the power to stop the bleeding. Every institution is largely on its own. Every rumor becomes dangerous. Every delay becomes fatal. And in the middle of the chaos, one man summons the most powerful bankers in America to his private library in Manhattan. He locks the doors, and he refuses to let anyone leave until they agree to save the economy. That man was J.P. Morgan. And what happened next was not just a rescue. It was a demonstration of private power on a national scale. It was a consolidation so complete that Congress would later call it the money trust. This is the story of how one banker became more powerful than the government itself. Morgan was born in 1837 into privilege, discipline, and finance. His father was an international banker. His family already had access to money, influence, and elite networks. Morgan did not begin with nothing. He inherited relationships others could never buy. He inherited credibility others could never earn. But inheritance alone does not explain his rise. What he built from that foundation changed American capitalism forever. He was educated in Europe. He learned foreign banking systems. He understood international credit. He saw money not as coins or paper, but as leverage. By the early 1900s, Morgan controlled more wealth than most nations. He financed railroads. He reorganized steel companies. He underwrote industrial expansion. He rescued governments. He bailed out the United States Treasury during the Panic of 1893. He became the man called when systems failed. J.P. Morgan didn't own America in the literal sense. He couldn't pass laws. He couldn't appoint officials, but he controlled the flow of capital. And in a capitalist economy, that's the closest thing to absolute power. He decided which businesses succeeded and which failed. He decided which industries grew. He decided who had access to credit. When the government needed money, it came to Morgan. When banks faced collapse, they turned to Morgan. When the economy teetered, Morgan was the only one with resources to pull it back. That's not democracy, that's plutocracy. Rule by the wealthy. The Panic of 1907 was the moment that truth became undeniable. One man held more economic power than the elected government. Congress responded by creating the Federal Reserve. But the system Morgan built, the consolidation he achieved, the precedent he set, all of that remains. Walk into any major bank today. Look at the mergers, the concentration of power in fewer institutions. Morgan would recognize the structure immediately, because he built it. In October 1907, J.P. Morgan locked bankers in his library and refused to let them leave until they agreed to save the economy. It worked. The economy was saved. But the cost was something most people still don't understand. The consolidation of American financial power into hands of a few men who answered to no one. Morgan owned America not by force, but by necessity. The system needed him, and that dependence gave him control more absolute than any law could grant. The banker who saved the economy was also the banker who reshaped it in his own image. And we've been living in that image ever since. End